A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 18. The morning was depressing, but Fergus was not depressed. He was out before the sun rose. He stood on his porch overlooking the Black River, inhaling the chill air, testing the temperature. It had turned cold, of a kind not likely to change as the daylight advanced. Sharp winds scudded small broken clouds upriver toward the mountains. It was a day of setback for spring. Fergus felt joyful. Should he walk or take the canoe? He decided on the canoe. Why not? It would give him access to the fourth wall if need be. The other three he could essay on foot. Not, he thought, that he was likely to try to scale any wall this morning, though he did not rule out the possibility. Now that he knew, as he was still thinking to himself at this hour, he knew that there was a girl held captive behind the wall. He must examine the whole rock-sided, spike-studded monstrosity from a different point of view. It was no longer 100,000 tons of inert stone. It was an enemy. It was bigger and stronger than he, but he had the advantage. He could move. More, he could think. And as he stalked it, that was what he must do, for there were those on the inside, on its side, who could also think. He wore the heavy rope-knit sweater Mrs. Adam had dried for him. As he pulled it over his head, waiting now for the bacon and scrambled eggs to finish, the coffee to stop percolating, he thought of her, and the feeling of comfort that descended over his shoulders was warmer than the wool, yet not dissimilar, a great joy to be able to tell her that her daughter did, after all, live, after all, less than a mile away. He could not, he realized, yet tell her any such thing, nor even hint, because it would set her hoping, make her smile, make her unguard her face and her brain to too cruel a disappointment if he should prove wrong. This was one of those things to think about as he walked. What to say to her, what to say to John, whom to talk to about the whole overwhelming intuition that had slid into his mind, a dart propelled from the soft, deep-lunged blowgun of a nightmare. Bales? He would seem the first choice, or Attenborough. The thing was his project. But what had he said? We can't stick so much as a toe in there, you see, because it's a diplomatic territory. If only they were not so hopelessly, immovably official. Or were they? Could Bales exchange his CIA suit for a sweater and a pair of sneakers? After he had pocketed the key to the boathouse and pulled on a pair of leather gloves, a rainproof nylon jacket, and a wool hat against the cold, he started down the zigzag path to the river, and he thought, those are candidates for dialogue number 3. There was only one candidate for number 1, and that was Willis. And for number 2, that was his mother. Willis knew more than he had told, and Fergus meant to find out what. What was the animal tree? He thought he had guessed the answer, but there was more. He eased the canoe silently out of the boathouse. As an afterthought, he tossed into its ribbed bottom a coil of heavy rope, one of many hanging from the boathouse wall. As always, from all boathouse walls, and a length of chain with a padlock on the end and a key in the padlock. His plan at this earliest stage was so simple as to be primitive, yet it was a necessary start. It was action. He would take the canoe downriver, past Villa Petrograd, down near the start of the rapids, pull it to shore, chain it up to a tree, and set out on foot. He would then circumambulate the entire wall with no more definite purpose than to see if it was all as formidable as the parts he had seen, or if there were scalable spots, places of crumbled rock and handholds. Also, if there were tall trees which might provide vantage points, to watch what went on the other side, as general or specific as it might be. The air was graying, but the water still wrinkled black around his paddle. On the ridgetop, one hoarse-voiced bird caught a glimmer of dawn and hailed it without spirit, a raspy salute to a frigid morning. But enough. It woke the others, and the chorus grew. The canoe slid downstream alone. Here came the sudden corner of the wall. This time Fergus did not pretend to fish, had not brought his rod or box. He glanced up the road as he floated past it, and was startled to see, or think he saw, men moving furtively uphill along the wall. The man, if he had been a man, wore dark green clothing, mottled like camouflage. It had been the gleam of his light eyes, in a dark-tanned face, full on looking over his shoulder, that had caught Fergus's eye, which meant, possibly, that the man had also seen him. The canoe by this time had passed the road on its way toward the villa's dock, the wall's end, and the rapids beyond. He skirted the dock and kept going, farther downstream than he had been before. The wall stopped, or rather turned abruptly right, after about 300 yards. Here he back-paddled, hanging still, while he looked for a place to tie up. The bank was bluff, but there was a landing place, a great gray sycamore undercut by the current, so that it leaned out over the river at a frightening angle. It would crash into the water within a decade or two, but not today. Fergus found a stalwart limb, looped his chain around it, clicked his padlock, and climbed ashore, tossing his paddle ahead of him, leaving the canoe afloat in the lee of the great gray trunk. As he concealed the paddle under a bush, he surveyed the woods before him and the state of the wall. It was instantly apparent the Russians did not want anyone climbing inward from outside the wall. The ground peripheral to it, for a distance of some 20 feet, had been kept clear. Nothing grew, along this stretch at least, larger than weeds and blackberry thorns, which were abundant and forbidding. Obviously, the villa's property included ground outside the wall, as well as inside, and the proprietors discouraged visitors. That was understandable. Small boys in the neighborhood would inevitably be curious, and in the fall there would be hunters. Villa Petrograd's grounds must contain hundreds of acres of prime hunting woodland. Fergus hurried. He wanted to study the two unknown sides of the square enclosure. Where, for instance, was the front gate, and still reach Willis's house by 7:30? He recalled that he had heard of a school bus that left before 8, and Willis must not take it. He now tried to formulate a conversation, but could not. Let it formulate itself when the time came. There, an enormous oak tree. Beyond it, 150 yards. What must be the front gate? Halfway up that tree, one should be able to look down on the whole layout, entrance, house, zoo, and all. The first branch was the hardest, 10 feet above ground, and he was glad he had brought the rope. He tossed it over, knotted it, and pulled himself up. 50 feet from the ground, with the tree still rising above him, should he care to go higher? He stopped, secured his position, and looked. It was high enough. He had a fair view of the villa, shadowy in the dim morning, its windows dark except for 2 or 3 lit on the ground floor. Rear, probably the kitchen. The gate, it was obviously the main entrance. A black asphalt driveway led to it from outside. This narrow road appeared out of the woods, and for its last quarter mile was landscape, cedars, and flowering shrubs, alternated, and some, for Cynthia, jasmine, were already in bloom. It led to the gate, impressively square-pillared, where the asphalt ended. As it passed through the gate, the drive changed abruptly and prettily to white pebbles. The landscaping on the inside, from what he could see, was more elaborate, with the accent on roses, azaleas, camellias, and hydrangeas. Perhaps 100 yards from the gate, the meticulous white gravel curved in a graceful S to deposit visitors under an old-fashioned shingle-walled, window-boxed porte-cochere. It all looked elegantly Victorian, opulent, and rather comfortable. At this hour, peaceful with sleep. Surely no one inside this charming, slumberous castle was dreaming of Cold War. And yet someone was, the coldest war of all, with one child as its first victim. And ultimately, he did not know yet how Dr. Schutz planned to use his weapon, on whom to deploy it, for whose benefit and to whose detriment, except, so far, the girl, for test and demonstration. But demonstration to whom? She would not be in the building before him, but almost a half-mile beyond. Fergus strained to recall the aerial photographs. A bit to the right, past what looked like tennis courts, a swimming pool, a soccer field. The light was improving. He could distinguish the goal net. Behind those woods, of formidable size, height, and blackness, he scrambled another 20 feet upward in his tree, and was rewarded. The zoo building itself was not to be seen, but at this altitude, patches of the far wall were visible. The wall that must parallel the rocky road to the river. And now, for a moment, Fergus thought he must be a victim of self-delusion. Then he knew he was right. He saw it, in fact, just inside the far wall. The same dark-clad figure he had glimpsed from the canoe. It was moving in the stealthiest of walks in the direction of the small zoo and the underground laboratory, where if Fergus was right, Alice and Adam was captive. Fergus climbed quickly down, staying quiet, not wanting to be seen from the villa, where 2 upstairs lights had turned on. He glanced at his watch, 7:15, and time enough yet for a look at the last wall. If the stealthy huntsman had disappeared around the corner of this last quadrant on the outside and had reappeared on the inside, he must have scaled the wall here. Perhaps not an important point. With a stout rope and a strong arm, Fergus now realized the wall should be vulnerable anywhere one chose except along the waterfront. Then why choose the 4th quadrant rather than one of the others? One groped stupidly for a reason and was, quite probably, thumped on the head to avoid being seen, either entering or departing. A second lump of knowledge followed. The pale-eyed hunter had done it before, knew who and what were where and how to avoid them. Fergus was jogging now, cutting wide of the main gate. Having crossed the blacktop road, cutting back to the final stretch of wall, here the woods grew thickest of all. This stretch of the wall, the 4th side of the square, ran parallel to the river, but half a mile back from it. Even here the Russians had cleared back all but the densest thorny undergrowth, combined with the wall itself, did not form an impregnable barrier, but merely a steep, prickly, and hideously discouraging one, not to be climbed on picnic outings, nor indeed by any but the most determined and experienced woodsman. And there, directly in front of Fergus, where he had done it, inconspicuous but not invisible, the track, minimally hacked through the brambles, ended in a one-man-sized clearing. At the top of the wall, directly above, circling one black spike of the crowning fence, he saw one slim brown loop of hemp. Astraddle the top, the invader had pulled up his rope after him and lowered it inside to ease his way down, and to climb, when the time came, up and out again. With no sure reason to do so, Fergus assumed that it belonged to the man he had seen near the wall. He considered and abandoned another assumption, that the rope and the man had nothing to do with him, or with Allison, or Dr. Schutz. He thought again, beware of coincidences. It was too much. There is a link between this prying stranger and me. He considered his own rope, wound at his waist, easy enough to loop it next to the stranger's, and follow him over the wall. He looked at his wristwatch, whose hands were pushing towards 7:30. Find Willis first. That was easily done. When Fergus reached the drive, Willis was coming down it, wearing a shiny black raincoat and rain hat. Behind him, his mother's white house, gave smoke from a single chimney, and looked, in the drizzling rain, on the edge of the wood, brighter and more cheerful than most houses could do in the sunshine. The cheerfulness was partly in the eye of the beholder, he knew, yet it would not be restrained. Willis said, "Hello, it's Mr. O'Neill." He seemed pleased and only slightly puzzled to see him so early. "You going to see Mother?" "No, I came to see you." "But you can't. The bus is coming." I want you not to go on the bus this morning." "But I have to. It goes to school." "Let's go back and ask your mother." "John's already gone. His bus is early." "That doesn't matter." Not unwillingly, Willis turned around and plodded back through the rain to his front door. He waited while Fergus knocked. She answered as if she had been expecting them. "Mr. O'Neill, so wet. Come inside. Willis, run or you'll miss your bus." "But he said—" "I wondered if Willis could go on an errand with me this morning. I could take him to school later." "An errand? What kind of errand?" "A serious one." "Come inside. All right, Willis, you don't have to catch the bus." "Can I go then?" "I don't know yet. Go to the kitchen and take off the wet coat." She led Fergus into the living room and sat down. She wore a blue straight-up-and-down house dress, and her pale hair hung over her loose shoulders. She tried to keep her expression uncommitted. So early an errand must be serious. Where will you go?" "Not far." This was the conversation he had not formulated. "I don't know how to tell you. In fact, I don't know what would be best, if you can agree not to tell you at all, but only promise to be back in an hour or less." She shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "That frightens me." "Believe me, I'm only looking for some information Willis might have. If he doesn't, no one will be any worse off, and I'll bring him back. I'll take him on to school. And if he does, then I'll tell you more. There will be more to tell. Does this have something to do with Allison? I don't know how to answer that. If you mean have I learned anything about her, no. It has to do with something quite different, a program I'm working on. But if I can talk to Willis, I might be able to say more. He added lamely, I know that's not very good. She said, I don't know who you are. You came fishing up the river, and you saved John's life. I made enough of that. Still, I wondered. You must be a friend of Mr. Wilcox. I thought you must be someone important. And why you're here is not my affair. She reached a decision and called out, Willis, are you ready to go with Mr. O'Neill? Willis appeared, dragging the shining coat. Where? Fergus said. Down the hill, not far. They put their coats on and set forth side by side, the tall and the short in the rain, while Mrs. Adam watched them through the front window. She was barely aware that the gray day seemed somewhat less cheerless than it had before. She tried to refrain from puzzling over this, from trying to explain it, and from the strange sudden visit. She turned instead to cleaning the breakfast table. Fergus sat on the white top of the newly cut stump, which felt damp instantly through the seat of his trousers. Willis stood near the wall. Tell me about the animal tree, Fergus said, and the chimpanzees. It's gone, said Willis. I told you they cut it down. Besides, it was a secret. Allie said not to tell. Tell me about it anyway, said Fergus. Now that it's gone, it won't matter. Willis thought about all the times he had sat under the tree waiting for Allie. How did Mr. O'Neill know about the chimpanzees? He thought about how long ago the secret had been promised, and it became clear to him that Mr. O'Neill was right. He ought to tell. It was all right. Allie wouldn't mind. It was all over now. And so he told. He told how they had wondered what lay on the other side of the high wall, and how Allie found, the tree that grew near it, the only one that did. I couldn't climb it, but Allie could. The first time she did, she came rushing down, and we went to the woods across the road, and she told me what she saw. What was that? A chimpanzee? All by itself? There were two men, keepers, one old and one young one. But after that, she didn't rush. She came down quietly like a cat so they wouldn't hear her because they wouldn't let us watch. What did the men do? They gave shots with needles to the chimpanzee. Yes, and it died. They got another one and it died too. They all got sick and died except Victor. Abel was the worst. Allie had in the end confided in him. His bones broke and that made Allie sick, so she fell out of the tree. I see. And what about Victor? Victor is still there. Willis looked at the stump and then at the wall. He came after. I guess he's still there. But there's no way to tell. He slid the next question in. Did Allie ever climb down inside the wall? Willis looked shocked. Oh no, they'd see her if she did. But there wasn't always someone there, not even any chimpanzees. Why couldn't she go down then? Well, because there wouldn't be anything to see. Anyway, she didn't. Fergus felt his theory, his reconstruction of the action, slipping away. It had seemed so obvious. The girl had simply got in the habit of climbing the tree to watch, and occasionally, when all was quiet, climbing down on the other side. Gradually, somehow, the enemy became aware of her presence, and one day they were waiting. But Willis was firm about this. She had not done it, or not to his knowledge. So she never went inside the wall at all? You're sure? Willis, for the first time, looked evasive. Well, not from the tree. He paused, and then, looking beaten, handed over the final secret. She only went 2 steps to look. 2 steps? I don't understand. They left the gate open. She went through the gate, but only 2 steps. He had betrayed Allie, but it was too late. It did not matter. He recalled the whole frightening thing again, the way the gate bumped shut behind her, and her bike lying there in the slanted sunlight. He was glad now to tell it to Mr. O'Neill. Yet for some reason, standing there in the rain, he began to cry, the tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. And that is the end of chapter 18.